In Tasmania, a teardrop of an island under the eye of the Australian mainland, there's the Thylacine, a creature that brings out folklore and folks armed with grainy images convinced they've seen the thing.
On the freezing night of the 7th of September 1936, inside a modest concrete enclosure at Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart, Tasmania, the world's last confirmed Tasmanian tiger spent her final hours completely alone. A simple mistake had left her trapped outside her sheltered den. Although spring was approaching, southern Tasmania was gripped by an unusually bitter cold. When morning arrived, the animal was found lifeless on the hard ground of the outdoor enclosure. For decades afterwards, confusion surrounded her identity. Historical records incorrectly described the final Thylacine as a male called Benjamin, and that mistake was repeated for generations. Modern research has revealed the truth. She was not a male at all. She was a female, and she was never known by the name Benjamin. The keepers who unknowingly left her outside that night could never have imagined they had just witnessed the disappearance of one of Earth's most remarkable mammals. Before we uncover the full story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you're fascinated by forgotten history, extinct creatures, and the mysteries science is still trying to solve, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The tragedy becomes even more heartbreaking when viewed alongside the timeline. Just 59 days earlier, on July 10, 1936, the Tasmanian government had finally granted legal protection to the species after more than a century of relentless hunting, bounty programs, attacks by dogs, disease, and the destruction of its natural habitat. A population once estimated at around 5,000 animals had been reduced to a single captive female. Protection came only after the species had already reached the edge of extinction. Before those new regulations had any real chance to matter, the last known individual was gone. Today, September 7th, is recognized across Australia as National Threatened Species Day, marking the death of the last confirmed Thylacine. The IUCN officially declared the species extinct in 1982, and 4 years later, in 1986, it was removed from Tasmania's protected species register after half a century had passed without a verified sighting. That is the version of history most people know. It appears in school textbooks, museum exhibits, documentaries, and encyclopedias. For decades, it has been accepted as the unquestioned conclusion of the Thylacine story, but that may not be the complete picture. Over the past decade, researchers have quietly uncovered evidence suggesting the species may have survived far longer than anyone once believed. This is not a science fiction claim that Tasmanian tigers are secretly roaming the wilderness today. Instead, it is a cautious, evidence-based possibility supported by statistical analysis and peer-reviewed research, proposing that small populations may have continued living in Tasmania's remote forests long after the last captive animal died. Some studies suggest they could have survived into the 1980s, others hint at the 2000s, and a few leave open the possibility of an even later disappearance. At the same time, remarkable discoveries have continued to reshape the story. A preserved thylacine head, stored in a jar at a Melbourne museum, has provided scientists with the most complete ancient genome ever recovered from an extinct species. In 2020, previously unseen footage of the last captive thylacine was uncovered in a Sydney film archive, offering the clearest moving images ever found. Since 2022, researchers at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery have been carefully correcting decades of mistaken records surrounding the identity of the final captive animal. Meanwhile, reports continue to arrive from Tasmania's wilderness. Every year, hikers, farmers, forestry workers, and travelers describe seeing an animal with dark stripes and a rigid tail slipping through eucalyptus forests at dusk. None of these sightings has been verified, yet together they continue to fuel one of the world's greatest wildlife mysteries. So why, nearly 90 years after the last confirmed captive died, does the Tasmanian tiger still refuse to disappear from scientific discussion? What does the latest research actually reveal about the species' true extinction date? And why are geneticists in laboratories across Melbourne and Dallas now attempting something once thought impossible, using DNA extracted from a thylacine specimen, preserved in ethanol for more than a century, to explore whether this extraordinary marsupial could one day be brought back? Even the animal's famous name is misleading. Despite being called the Tasmanian tiger, it was never a tiger at all. European settlers gave it that nickname because of the dark stripes stretching across its lower back and tail, which gave it a tiger-like appearance from a distance. In reality, it was neither a feline nor a placental mammal. The thylacine belonged to the marsupial family, making it a distant relative of kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and possums, a completely unique predator unlike anything else alive today. Until its disappearance in 1936, the thylacine held the title of the largest carnivorous marsupial on Earth. Its scientific name, Thylacinus cynocephalus, comes from Greek and roughly translates to dog-headed pouched animal. The description suited the creature perfectly because it seemed to combine features from several different animals into one. At first glance, European settlers often mistook it for a medium-sized dog. Its body shape, movement, and even its hunting style appeared remarkably canine based on the few observations that survive, but a closer look revealed something entirely different. Like all marsupials, it carried its young in a pouch. Females had a backward-facing pouch that protected their babies while moving through dense vegetation, while males also possessed a pouch-like fold that partially enclosed the reproductive organs, helping shield them as they ran. Its tail was equally distinctive. Rather than the flexible, wagging tail of a dog, the thylacine's tail was thick and rigid at the base, extending almost straight behind the body like that of a kangaroo. This unusual structure even allowed the animal to use its tail for balance when standing upright on its hind legs. Perhaps its most astonishing feature was its jaw. The thylacine could open its mouth to nearly 80 degrees, one of the widest jaw openings ever recorded in any mammal. Rare photographs and surviving film footage of the last captive individuals clearly capture this extraordinary ability, with the jaws stretching far wider than those of any dog or cat. Scientists still debate the purpose of this remarkable gape. It may have been an adaptation for hunting, an intimidating display used to warn rivals, or a combination of both. Interestingly, captive thylacines were frequently seen opening their mouths this wide while yawning, particularly during periods of stress. Because of this, many researchers believe the behavior may have been more related to communication or emotion than feeding. Whatever its purpose, this dramatic jaw movement remains one of the species' most unforgettable characteristics. Long before European settlement, the thylacine occupied a much larger range. Fossils and archaeological discoveries show that it once lived not only in Tasmania, but also across mainland Australia and New Guinea. Those mainland populations disappeared roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, most likely after the arrival of the dingo, whose introduction created intense competition for food and territory. When the first British settlers arrived in Tasmania in 1803, the species had already become isolated on the island by the waters of Bass Strait. At that time, experts estimate around 5,000 thylacines still survived in the wild. What followed became one of history's best documented examples of human-driven extinction. In 1830, the Van Diemen's Land Company, a large agricultural enterprise operating extensive sheep farms in northwest Tasmania, introduced the first official bounty on thylacines. Farmers believed the predators were responsible for significant losses of livestock, particularly sheep. Modern historians, however, have challenged that belief. Research suggests that the number of sheep actually killed by thylacines was greatly exaggerated. Many losses were more likely caused by feral dogs, poor farming practices, and inadequate animal management. In fact, the thylacine's relatively narrow jaws and modest bite strength made it poorly suited to bringing down healthy adult sheep. Unfortunately, public opinion had already turned against the species, and the bounty remained in place. The campaign intensified in 1888, when the Tasmanian government introduced its own reward system, paying £1 for every adult thylacine killed and 10 shillings for each pup. Over the next 21 years, before the program ended in 1909, a total of 2,184 bounty payments were officially recorded. Considering that the island's population had begun at roughly 5,000 animals, thousands were wiped out within a single generation using public funds alone. Yet hunting was only part of the disaster. During the 1890s and the early 20th century, a devastating disease, believed by many scientists to have been a form of canine distemper spread by domestic dogs, swept through the remaining population. Combined with relentless persecution and shrinking habitat, the epidemic pushed the species into an irreversible decline. By 1909, when the government ended its bounty program, the thylacine was already on the brink of extinction. The last widely accepted wild thylacine was shot by farmer Wilf Batty on the 13th of May, 1930, leaving only a single captive animal at Beaumaris Zoo. In 1936, that final thylacine died alone in captivity. Long believed to be a male named Benjamin, researchers confirmed in 2022 that the last animal was actually an unnamed female. Only 3 minutes and 17 seconds of footage of a living thylacine survives. In 2020, another 21 seconds of forgotten film from 1935 was discovered, offering one final glimpse of the species, but no evidence it had survived. The mystery deepened in 2023, when Professor Barry Brook and his team analyzed 1,237 reported thylacine sightings using a statistical extinction model. Their findings challenged the official timeline, suggesting the species may have survived in small numbers until the late 20th century, long after its official extinction date of 1936. According to the analysis, the species most likely did not become extinct in 1936. Instead, the evidence suggested that small scattered populations may have survived in Tasmania's remote wilderness until the late 1980s or even the early 2000s. Importantly, the researchers did not argue that thylacines are still roaming Tasmania today. Their conclusion was far more cautious. The species almost certainly did go extinct, but later than the traditional timeline has long suggested. Another intriguing pattern emerged from the data. The strongest and most reliable reports, those submitted by trained field biologists, experienced foresters, and lifelong residents familiar with Tasmania's bushland, were concentrated during the second half of the 20th century. After around 2000, those high-quality sightings became increasingly rare before fading away almost entirely. This pattern suggests that a tiny remnant population may have survived for decades after the last captive thylacine died, gradually declining until the species finally disappeared. That is the real scientific conclusion. Not that the thylacine is secretly alive today, but that it may have survived far longer than the official extinction date recorded in history books. If you're enjoying this fascinating journey into one of history's greatest wildlife mysteries, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications. We explore incredible true stories, ancient mysteries, and scientific discoveries every week. This also makes modern-day thylacine sightings much more difficult to interpret. Every reported encounter must now be examined alongside decades of historical records, eyewitness testimony, and statistical research. Responsibility for separating genuine evidence from mistaken identity largely falls to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, the institution responsible for assessing reported thylacine sightings. The museum's best-known expert is Nick Mooney, an honorary wildlife biologist who has spent decades investigating claims that the species survived. Rather than dismissing reports outright, Mooney has carefully examined virtually every major piece of evidence submitted over the last 40 years. Again and again, the supposed thylacines have turned out to be familiar native animals. The most common source of confusion is the Tasmanian pademelon, a small wallaby that lives throughout the same forests once inhabited by thylacines. In poor light or from a distance, its size, movement, and shape can easily resemble the long-extinct predator. One of the most famous examples occurred in March 2021, when the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia released trail camera photographs they claimed showed an entire family of living thylacines. The images quickly made headlines around the world. However, after a formal investigation by experts at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, including Nick Mooney, the verdict was clear. The animals were Tasmanian pademelons, not surviving thylacines. It was another familiar cycle, an exciting claim, worldwide media attention, expert analysis, and ultimately a scientific explanation. Yet despite this, new sightings continue to be reported year after year, keeping the mystery alive. Most people who report seeing a thylacine genuinely believe they have encountered something extraordinary. Tasmania's forests are dense, visibility is often poor, and many native animals can look remarkably different under low-light conditions. In those fleeting moments, even experienced observers can mistake one species for another. The persistence of these reports is therefore not proof of an organized hoax. Instead, it reflects how deeply the image of the thylacine remains embedded in Tasmania's landscape and culture. The forests where it once lived still exist, and the environmental conditions that make mistaken sightings possible have never disappeared. When these modern reports are considered alongside Barry Brook's 2023 statistical study, an interesting picture begins to emerge. The research suggests that the thylacine likely survived for many years after the death of the last captive individual, meaning its extinction was probably a gradual process rather than a single moment in history. At the same time, the scientific evidence also indicates that the species has almost certainly vanished today. Public fascination has continued long after the data stopped supporting the existence of a surviving population. Then, in 2022, another remarkable discovery reshaped the story. In 2022, researchers Robert Paddle and Catherine Medlock uncovered a major historical mistake. After reviewing museum records, they proved that the last captive thylacine was not a male named Benjamin, as widely believed, but an unnamed female. Even more remarkably, her preserved remains had been sitting inside the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery for 86 years, used occasionally for educational purposes without anyone realizing they belonged to the last confirmed Tasmanian tiger. While historians corrected the past, scientists began looking to the future. In 2017, Andrew Pask and his team at the University of Melbourne successfully sequenced the first complete nuclear genome of the Thylacine, opening the door to possible de-extinction research. The project expanded in 2022 when Colossal Biosciences partnered with Pask's lab to create the Tiger Lab, aiming to recreate a thylacine-like animal using advanced genetic engineering. Although the closest living relative, the tiny fat-tailed dunnart, diverged from the thylacine around 40 million years ago, researchers continue to make progress. In 2024, scientists reconstructed the most complete ancient genome ever assembled, using a 110-year-old preserved thylacine head. They also introduced more than 300 genetic edits into dunnart cells, the biggest step yet toward recreating the species. Even so, experts caution that hundreds more breakthroughs will be needed before anything resembling a living thylacine becomes possible. Today, the Tasmanian tiger is no longer just a story of extinction. It has become one of the world's most ambitious genetic research projects, offering a glimpse into whether science might one day bring back one of Australia's most iconic lost animals. For now, the project represents one of the most ambitious experiments in modern genetics, a bold attempt to answer a question that, until recently, belonged entirely to science fiction. Bringing back the Tasmanian tiger is far more difficult than making just 300 genetic edits. Scientists agree that thousands of changes may ultimately be needed, and while opinions remain divided, one thing is certain: the research is real. A 110-year-old preserved thylacine specimen has provided one of the most complete ancient genomes ever recovered, making the species a major focus of modern science once again. The story is also more complex than history books suggest. Although officially declared extinct in 1936, statistical research indicates the thylacine may have survived in small numbers until the late 20th century, possibly even the early 2000s. Its last known remains were only correctly identified in 2022, while new archival footage from 1935 surfaced in 2020. Every year, hundreds of people still report seeing thylacines. So far, every investigated case has been explained as a pademelon, fox, or feral cat. That doesn't prove the species is alive today, but it does show that the mystery refuses to disappear. Meanwhile, scientists at the TIGRR lab and Colossal Biosciences are attempting the world's most ambitious marsupial de-extinction project. Whether they can truly recreate the Tasmanian tiger remains unknown, but the effort is already rewriting the species' history. The official record says the last thylacine died on September 7, 1936. Modern evidence suggests its story may have continued for decades beyond that date. Today, its genome has been reconstructed, its identity corrected, and the dream of seeing this extraordinary animal again is no longer confined to history books. Perhaps the Tasmanian tiger's story didn't end in 1936. It may only now be entering its most remarkable chapter.